Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching. So in today's episode, I'm going to go through some of the basic assumptions of sports coaching through a self-determination theory lens insofar as the role of the coach, the effects of the coach, and how some of the various sort of elements of self-determination theory is a macro theory of motivational psychology, and it has its own sort of constituent parts, and looking at motivational regulation, and understanding the connection between different motivation types and psychological needs, and just to kind of help you as a coach or as a coach developer, or maybe in a researcher in this space, someone with a growing interest in this space, sort of understand some of the core fundamentals of the premise of self-determination theory and why we should care about it and how it might change the way in which you view motivation, both for athletes primarily, but also actually in terms of even understanding the coach experience too, for the purpose of, just for brevity and to keep things on point today. We'll keep it around the motivational effects on athletes, but I just dare to say that it's an explanation of human behaviour in general. So, and coaches are part of that equation, aren't they? So, but I just mentioned that. I digress. So, so let's kick it off with the first basic assumption, which is in coaching. So there's that sort of cartoon coach that you might see as someone blowing a whistle and shouting at athletes and offering that external motivation, in some respects, then it's, there's a assumption of the coach as being the motivator. So the coach's job is to motivate the athletes. It's sort of, some people may say that that's, the responsibility of motivation lies with the coach. Now, a self-determination theory lens would actually spin that and say, actually, it's not the primary role of the coach isn't to be the motivator, but instead to create an environment in which the athlete motivates themselves. So it's not to deny the coach, a responsibility around the motivation and all the different elements that would entail, but it's to who's in the driving seat here, and part of that is because there's a long line of research across various domains, not just sport, that is suggested that internal drivers are those that are strongest, that are those most heavily linked to positive outcomes, and therefore as a result of that, we have to then consider, well, the coach's job is to get athletes into this state where their internal drivers are salient, and it's the athlete who should drive this, because it's them alone who's going to be there across the full stretch of their sport involvements. So that's the first basic assumption, in terms of how you might flip it in your head from recognising yourself, the coach, as the prime motivator in an athlete's world, to actually being a facilitator. So you hear that a lot, mostly in sort of pedagogical conversations around, as the coaching and intervention. In some respects, the coach being a direct driver and the athlete's learning to is actually coaching in the design of the practice. So it's a similar sort of thing from a motivational standpoint, from the coach being that prime motivator to the coach actually creating an environment and facilitating an environment where the athlete is empowered to motivate themselves. That's one basic assumption, I think, to get in your head here, in the way that we view the world of motivation from a self-determination theory lens. The second assumption is, I think, it's really important, is how do most people think about motivation in terms of the language that they use and what type of reality that language confers. So, what's the typical thing we say? An athlete is lacking motivation, or an athlete is very motivated. So I'm going to say to you that, there's no such thing as an athlete lacking or being demotivated, maybe more specifically. Every athlete is motivated. It's the type of motivation that they embody at the time that is what's important here. In the same way, no athletes, it's just a stereotype that we hear. It's just common language, and we need to get away from that. It's the same way that we hear people talk about that athlete lost concentration, and anyone, with an understanding of concentration understands that we don't lose concentration. It's just that our mental spotlight drifts to something less relevant. So it's that same thing again from a motivational perspective. So there is no such thing as a demotivated athlete, but there are better and worse quality forms of motivation, arguably, that are respectively related to different outcomes, more adaptive outcomes, more maladaptive outcomes. So that's something that I think is really important to understand. And again, an athlete can have a lot of motivation types. So again, it's not deny that there's quantity is there, but we need to deal in types. Self-determination theory, SDT for short, deals in motivational quantity and also types, so quantity and quality, okay, amounts and types, both things at once. So if we're now at the stage that we're recognising, okay, there are various types of motivation. What are they? Now, the motivation for self-determination theory exists on a spectrum. Okay, so the prototypical form of self-determined motivation, and it's in the name, is the most internalized form of motivation, which is intrinsic motivation. So that's intrinsic motivation is motivation where pure joy and motivation to compel someone to take part in activity, it comes from nothing more than the basic inbuilt enjoyment and interest of doing the task. So there's no reward within this. The reward is participation in the task. Okay, so it's a very whole, very pure form of self-determined motivation. Okay, that's why it's interchangeable. Intrinsic motivation is interchangeable with the word self-determined motivation. You know, it's that is the idea around that. And I've maybe jumped a step there insofar as it's important to recognise when we say why someone's doing a task, it's if we were to flesh that out, what we're actually meaning is what is the value that someone assigns to a behaviour? What is the reasons for why someone feels compelled to act? What is the environment that they're part of sending them insofar as signals for what is expected of them and their involvement within that environment? So, because it's a psychosocial theory, you know, so, and I'll come on to that more about the environmental elements later on, but just wanted to quickly just a wee footnote there as we got into the very first motivation type, which is as I say, the prototypical form of self-determined motivation, intrinsic motivation. Do we all do activity for purely the absolute innate interest of doing the task, or the innate enjoyment that we derive from doing the task? Of course not. People are far too complicated for that. So obviously there is more extrinsic or external. It means the same thing for why we do anything. Self-determination theory sees these on a spectrum of more self-determined extrinsic forms of motivation and less self-determined extrinsic forms of motivation. So what that means is that while there are extrinsic forms of motivation that someone can have for doing a task, there are, strictly speaking, higher quality forms of that extrinsic motivation. It can't compete in the same level of self-determination as intrinsic motivation because it's just not as pure as that. But there are, ones that are pushing the envelope a little bit more in that respect. They're going closer to the letter there. And that's these various ones that I'm going to get into now. So let's say silver place in the battle for self-determination theory. So the very first of the self-determined extrinsic drivers, they're not quite intrinsic motivation, is integrated regulation. So it's better understood as, where we take part in activity because it's part of our identity. So you can understand how heavily integrated that is within someone's psyche, where it's part of who they are. So this is an athlete who takes part in sport for one of many reasons, but in terms of the integrated element of their motivation is because they are an athlete. It's part of who they are. Or maybe they attach a value to it that's not even so much inbuilt into the title or status of athlete, but rather what they see participation in sport as being instrumental towards insofar as deeply held values like resilience, discipline, character. These are some of the words that we might use to describe ourselves, someone who is committed, and that matters a lot to them. And so that's very personal, and I'm sure you can appreciate that. Don't see, it's not often, of all the motivational regulations, it's not the one that's used that much at all with children. With adults, yeah, with children, not so much, just partly because of ego development and just the fact that, character, and these are fairly, that sense of self is being developed in a child still, so typically that's where we don't see it used as much in studies, so you might see it being skipped sometimes in measurement tools and things like that. So integrated regulation. The next form of motivation, still extrinsic, but we would still put it on the side of being more self-determined extrinsic motivation. Identified regulation, where basically we have attached value to doing a task and it serves some higher order goal, okay? Not to the same level as, a goal that's driven towards character, but I know it blurs the line somewhat there, but maybe something that's more value driven to something else attached to the activity and the goals that we have for what we want to get out of the activity, in this case sport. So kind of like an athlete who doesn't really like the gym, but they know that going to the gym, it helps them be a better rugby player. So that sort of idea. So we've attached a value to it. And again, we need that a lot, don't we? Because oftentimes we need to do tasks that we don't always enjoy, but we need to delay gratification in order to achieve longer term goals, or those sorts of things. So identify regulation is quite important in that respect. Athletes will use that and rely on that quite a lot when engaged in sport. Then we cross into the threshold of more non-self-determined extrinsic forms of motivation. So the one at the other side of the fence here, okay, across this sort of spectrum of internalisation, or lack thereof as we start to move closer towards this side than the other side that we've just been at, is introjected regulation. So this is sort of like guiltivation. I've just made that word up, but it's kind of like where an athlete feels guilty, and they feel maybe their relationship with someone else or their feelings about themselves are under threat unless they engage in an activity or engage in a behaviour. So you might go, well, and this is what's quite insidious about this form of motivation, is that the athlete is still internalised the reasons for doing it. Okay, so it's still driven by the athlete. However, that seed was planted externally. So why do they feel guilty? Why are they feeling under threat in order to carry out this behaviour, and that they decide to go along with it? But why is it they feel that compelled to do it, that the genesis of that behaviour isn't from them, it's external to them. So it's kind of like a coach or a mum and dad telling an athlete, you're being lazy, or I can't believe you're not going to do that. I'm not angry and disappointed, that, all that sort of stuff. So, or someone maybe not wanting to let their coach down, not wanting to let their family down, not want to those sorts of things. It come even more complicated. Maybe not wanting to let themselves down as well, depending on the level of engagement and commitment they've already exerted towards some larger aim. And again, you're probably, hopefully, starting to listen to this and actually start to see why these different forms of motivation need to be called upon at different times. Maybe, I don't know, but that's a conversation for another day. I do know I have some quite strong feelings on that, but I don't want to take up this episode too much with that. That conversation will come at a different time. There's a previous episode that you can watch where I made a guest appearance on Rugby Coach Weekly, and we talk a little bit about that. But that is it. So, and then beside that, okay, the far end of the extrinsic spectrum is what we would call external regulation. So this is where an athlete engages in a task because there is the opportunity to gain a reward for doing it, or in order to avoid a punishment of some sort. So athletes are motivated by, getting a trophy, or motivated by avoiding some sort of punishment by their coach, doing laps of the park because of something that's happened or whatever, that maybe doesn't meet expectations, those sorts of things. And I'm sure you can understand that is definitely, that's why it's quite explicitly in the name, it's externally regulated. That is the environment around the athlete bribing or coercing them into a behaviour. So, and then what we've actually got now, so that basically makes up the spectrum of extrinsic motivators. So, and this comes from one of the many theories of self-determination theory, organism integration theory, that sort of like helps us understand how we can internalise behaviour from more extrinsic to more intrinsic or internal, if it doesn't quite get to the point of being intrinsic. But there is actually, and it's not a developmental spectrum, is in a way. It's not like you move from external regulation to introjected to identified. It's not how it works. It's actually that, you can jump across in between these things at various intervals, because of different contextual events, maybe across a long term, maybe across a short term, but in a really potent way, quite more episodic events that can occur as well, whatever. So I'll return to that. There is actually a final behaviour regulation that doesn't actually sit as being extrinsic at all. It's called amotivation, and it's almost like a non-form of motivation. It's like a non-regulation. It's actually sometimes characterised as a form of sort of helplessness. It's where someone neither feels forced nor intrigued, nor they aren't able to manifest any reason for doing an activity, it's almost like going through the paces. So people either disengage and it's almost like not doing the activity, or they go through the motions in a passive way. So it's like, just passively going through the motions. So that you can probably tell me that could literally be someone that just doesn't do an activity, ceases to do an activity, and why they don't do it, to someone who does it, but in a way that's just so integrated with the self. Now, that integration with the self, not to just repeat, the very first form of self-determined extrinsic motivation, but the reason why we use that sort of language is because you've got to understand that self-determination theory has a view on human motivation. It's a form of positive psychology. Okay, it's growth orientated, and it posits, and a lot of the evidence would suggest that people have an innate inborn desire to self-actualize, to create an ever more cohesive, integrated form of the self, in terms of one that's harmoniously attuned to what we want and for our own control over an activity and those sorts of things. Like it should reflect our values, our beliefs, our actions, or our actions rather should reflect our values, our beliefs, our goals, those sorts of things, and be very personally orientated. And it believes that everyone has a natural inclination towards this self-growth, provided that their environment, social environment that surrounds them, because kind of like, you might have heard that equation, it's like personality plus environment equals behaviour. Let's say the personality element, without stretching too many things here, is about that innate propensity towards growth. But we need plus a supportive environment that nourishes that innate desire towards growth. And if it does, then great, you'll see ever more internalised reasons for doing activities, and there should be an ever more cohesive relationship between what we do and what we want to do, and those sorts of things. But if it doesn't, then that is where that innate growth desire is somewhat polluted, and that is where more complicated motivational orientations develop. Okay, now an example of this, and well, before I come back to what an example of this looks like, I think at this stage it's important to just also explicitly state that we're not expecting any one athlete, any one person to only inhabit one of these worlds, one of these behaviour regulations. That's not the case. We are all motivated by several things at once. However, what's really important is what is the main drivers, if again on that spectrum, on what side of the fence, from non-self-determined to self-determined, would most of our reasons for why we do something lie. It's where most of our reasons for why we do something is what would constitute as being our motivational orientation. And this is where there's been a lot of markers that have been identified within the literature and studies, track some of these, the different outcomes that people have achieved based on the different regulation types that they've possessed. This is where more self-determined forms of motivation have been linked to things like enhanced, energy, effort in the task, persistence, longer persistence in the task, performance in the task, concentration, teamwork, sporting-like behaviour, all these different things. So there's so many positive adaptive outcomes. And again, we can go into some of them in a later episode, I believe. So but there's so many different adaptive outcomes that have been associated with that, whereas the opposite is typically tended to be true for people whose reasons for doing an activity across the long term are more non-self-determined. Okay, and recognise that I've said across the long term because, you'll note yourself, and this is something as coaches we must be aware of, like for quick jabs, for, quick dirty results over a short term, the really powerful external reasons for doing something can have a really potent impact on our behaviour and lead to a lot of short-term results insofar as persistence, effort, performance. Sometimes that does happen, but what we see is, in what self-determination theory does, is it looks at the long-term implications of our environment and the signals that it sends to us for why we should be taking part there, and those sorts of things. And it's not even just sends to us, but the signals that it creates within us. The longer term we see these issues. So that's a little bit around that. Now, I'm going to come back to the internalisation element here. But first, in order to understand more about the internalisation element, where we can move from more external reasons to more internalised reasons, if we aren't already at that point, or why even, easily said, why we would have a motivational orientation that's closer towards that end of the spectrum, we say, that is more self-determined. Well, what's linked to motivational orientation is the extent to which, and this is where when we talk about how does our social environment nurture, and foster the higher quality motivation, it's determined by the extent to which it satisfies our fundamental psychological needs, and them being the psychological need for autonomy, for competence, and for relatedness. Very quickly, autonomy is the desire to, feel empowered, feel in control of our behaviour, feel like we are responsible for our actions. You can understand why that's, very fundamental within a theory that is built around self-determination. It's kind of in the name. Self-determination, intrinsic motivation, autonomous motivation, it all means the same thing. So autonomy is quite a central driver. The other two needs that I'm about going to aren't, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But autonomy, you then get the need for competence. As I say, that's about how efficacious do we feel around our capacity to do well and to interact with our environment effectively. And then you've got that final psychological need, which is the need for relatedness. That is the need to feel a sense of belonging and cared for. In some respects, to feel like you can care for others and be part of a community. So because we're social beings, we want to be close to people. So how does this work? How does that fit in? How do the psychological needs connect, and the extent to which our environment is satisfying these three needs, and how does that link to are the drivers that come out of that for why we continue to engage or disengage, or something in the middle of that? Well, if you want, let's go back to the most prototypical form of self-determination. If I'm going to be intrinsically motivated towards an activity, I really need to feel in control of the activity. How could I be doing something out of the pure interest and enjoyment for it if I don't feel that I have control over it? Because I need to be brought to it on my own volition in order to inhabit that really pure form of motivation. And even if it's not quite at the point of intrinsic motivation, and it then exists on a more on the spectrum of extrinsic reasons for it. If you look at integrated regulation or identified regulation, those are still working towards something that has an internalized, an internal driver within it. That I am seeing value in activity, that I am feeling an activity integrates with who I am, my sense of self, my character development, that sort of thing. That is still a very, that is innately autonomous. So that's why autonomy is so important towards getting towards that higher end of the spectrum. Now, where did the other two psychological needs come in? Well, again, if you really wanted to do an activity over a longer stretch of time and in a way that we think it's really high quality and adaptive, then we also should feel like we're mastering it in some way. We need to feel like we're getting better at it in order to keep doing it over a longer stretch and in a way that's conducive to doing it well, is that we feel we're getting better at it. It's like you do something forever, you never get any better at it. You're not going to do it forever. You're doing it eventually, or else it will grind on you to be able to do it forever without it becoming an externalized reasons for why you do it. Because you want to feel that you're getting better at something, and that's why it can really help with that internalization. Because even if you don't initially feel completely in control, getting better at something can still be a very important driver for why you return to something and why you over time start to attach value and volitionally want to engage in something, even if it's hard, even if it's maybe directed elsewhere, by someone else who's leading in the activity. So it's really, really important. That sense of competence is really important to us as human beings, as athletes as well. And then the third psychological need, relatedness, and the role that plays in the internalization process is that, well, many people engage in an activity, if not for purely internally driven reasons and that they feel in control or even that they feel good at it, many people engage in activity because it's not the activity per se that drives them, but it's the relationship that they have with others who are engaged in the activity that drives them. It's like, how many times do you hear, athletes who took up the sport because it made them feel closer to their parents, or a kid who takes up a sport and wants to do well in a sport. And this is actually even, this is where we see interlinks between the different psychological needs, but because they want to feel closer and more accepted with their friends. So then that's like, well, okay, I want to feel more accepted by my friends. I'm going to join this sport club. I'm going to do well in it. And the more well I do, the higher status I get in terms of my relationship with people. And then that, builds on it even further. So, and then all of a sudden, because I'm doing it well, I then actually want to then be in it, more involved more, and all of a sudden I'll get more autonomous reasons for doing it. So you can see how the three psychological needs, you can scale that up across different domains, levels of sport, and maybe start, if I can maybe spark a wee bit of reflection in you at the moment, think about how that does relate to your context. Think about how that relates to your athletes, even if it's even easier for you. Think what are your reasons for why you took part in sport back in the day? If you want to talk about it in the context of why do you coach, then again, that's absolutely fine as well. And maybe I'd always encourage a wee bit of introspection towards some of the reasons for why we do things, just for how it ensures that you still doing things for why you want to do, or is your environment creating your sense of reason for action, which is something I think we always need to consider, just to take stock of ourselves and those sorts of things as a coach. But that is the role that plays in things. Okay, so that hopefully allows you to understand what does self-determination think about. How does it change the way that we view some of the fundamental elements of coaching, insofar as who's responsible for motivation? How do we actually conceive of what motivation is? What language do we attach to it? Don't say demotivated anymore. Everyone's motivated by something. To then actually, right, what are the different motivational types? So if we now can see that motivation exists on a spectrum, what are the different regulators? What's the relationship between those different regulators? It's a spectrum in the sense that it's not hierarchical, because it's not a simplified view on human motivation, okay, because it also allows us to understand, like I said, that human motivation, it's what's the main drivers. There's multiple drivers, and what's the main drivers, and hopefully also helps you maybe take stock of, well, our athletes want to do the activity, they want to have, there's a purpose for why they want to do it. They might, well, no, not so much that they want to do it, but our athletes want to be ever more harmoniously self-integrated with themselves, between themselves and the environment. They want that harmonious relationship between how they feel and what they do. Okay, and your job as a coach is how can you bring an athlete closer towards internalizing the reasons for doing your sport, and less close towards more extrinsic reasons and externalized reasons for why they do your sport. And that's where, again, across the short term, you can see, yes, you can use lots of less externalized reasons for doing something, but across a longer stretch, it doesn't really pay dividends. And hopefully now you can also recognize that, how do you actually get them towards anywhere in that equation? It's the extent to which you're satisfying versus frustrating their psychological needs. And now we can understand the role that, how the environment supports us, the role that it can play in whether we do that task, how we do that task, and reasons why we do that task, and how they interweave between the antecedents of behaviour and the effects of it in terms of the experiences that we have as athletes, and they're all often very different, aren't they? So yeah, hopefully that made sense, guys. As I say, we're going to keep digging into this topic more and more on different angles as the weeks and months go on. Please continue the conversation. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. And by all means, send me a message. Happy to receive feedback as well, even on the email for the show as well. That's absolutely fine. So yeah, so keep thinking about that. Hopefully this episode's been helpful to you, and I will see you next time.